Hey everyone, Dr. Crayhay here. In this Chapter 14 lecture, I'll be discussing the importance of external validity. When you're evaluating the importance or the impact of a study, you need to consider replicability. So I talked about that in the last lecture video. Another thing that you need to consider is the external validity of the study. So there are a couple components of this. One is generalizing to other participants, which means you have to consider the sample. Not only, what kind of sample, what are the kinds of people in that sample, how was that sample collected? Was it a random sample? Was it a convenience sample? All of those questions that we've been talking about this entire semester. Those will inform how well the sample represents the population of interest, the population that the researchers are trying to generalize to. You'll also want to consider how well the study can generalize to other settings. So if you're talking about an experiment and it was done in the lab, you have to consider how well this would be reproduced in everyday life. So labs tend to be very controlled circumstances. You limit what people are exposed to, and so there's a pretty decent chance that those results would not replicate in the real world. You can have what's called experimental realism, so maybe you've set up your study in the lab to replicate a real-life setting to make it a little bit more real. What we're really talking about here is ecological validity. So what's the likelihood that something that happened in a lab would repeat itself in everyday life? So you have to consider how well that would generalize to other settings. So does a study have to be generalizable to many people? Not necessarily. So you have a research study, you've defined your population of interest, so every study will have a different population. Maybe you want to know about college students in general. Maybe you want to talk about the entire United States. Maybe you want to talk about females in the South. Whatever you've defined your population to be for that particular study, you want to make sure that your sample can generalize to that. Oftentimes you'll want it to be a fairly big group of people, but it doesn't have to be that case. What you do want is for your results to generalize beyond the group of people that you have collected data from. Otherwise, you're not really participating in the research process very well. So you do want it to generalize to a population that is bigger than your sample, but it doesn't have to be a certain number of people. It doesn't have to generalize to 5,000 people to kind of, hit a check mark. Okay, well, this one's important. You just want to be able to generalize to a population of interest, whatever you've defined that to be as a researcher. Does the study have to take place in a real-world setting? So again, this returns to the idea of ecological validity. Something that happened in a lab, could it happen in the real world? There are things you can do in a lab setting to more closely approximate a real-life setting. So again, you have to kind of balance these things and consider these things. In some cases, you'll absolutely want things to work out in a real-life setting. Other times, you're really just kind of investigating, you're poking around a little bit, and so maybe you'll establish some things in the lab, and then a future study would take it out into the real world. So it really depends on your goals as a researcher, what kind of research you're conducting. So your textbook talks about a theory testing mode versus a generalization mode. So maybe you're in theory testing mode. You just want to get the groundwork done. You want to get the overall, what happens in these kinds of situations. So in there, you're not as concerned with the ecological validity. You just bring people into the lab and see what happens. In future iterations of that study, maybe you would be in generalization mode where you go out into the real world and you see how these things play out. So again, we're balancing research priorities from study to study, but these are all good questions to ask as you're evaluating the importance of a study through its external validity. A couple of things to remember as you are considering the external validity of a study. First of all, it's a population, not the population. So there's not one population that every study is trying to generalize to. The researcher will define who they'd like to generalize to, and then that becomes their population of interest. So there are a lot of different populations depending on what research you're looking at, and these will change by article, by, psychology subfield, all of those different kinds of things. There are many populations that we're interested in. So it's one thing to keep in mind. Another is that external validity comes from how, not how many. So one mistake that I see students making a lot in their early training is that they'll say, oh, well, they collected data from 2,000 people. This is automatically good. This is a strong study. The more important question is how, not how many. So maybe I took 2,000 people from one specific location. That's not going to be very generalizable. What you really want is to ask how those people were found, how that data was collected. So is it a representative sample, stratified sample, convenience sample, how were they asked questions, all of those kinds of things. So how the procedures are more important than just finding a bunch of people and asking them a bunch of questions or running them through a survey protocol. The last, just because a sample comes from a population does not mean that it generalizes to that population. So here we get into kind of the representativeness. So say we have a large population, we could theoretically only take a subset of that population as our sample. Maybe we only took men from that population, but there were also women in that population. In that case, it would not generalize. So you really need your sample to be representative of your population. You have to be very purposeful when you're getting your samples if you want them to generalize. So just because you've pulled a sample from the population, that doesn't mean that you're good to go, that you don't have anything to worry about. Again, you have to consider how that sample was chosen. How did you find those people? How were they selected? What kinds of people did you decide to include? This slide gives us a side-by-side comparison of what your textbook calls generalization mode versus theory testing mode. So maybe in theory testing mode, you really just want to lay down the foundation, really explore a topic, and figure out what's going on. Generalization mode comes a little bit later in the research process. Maybe you're a handful of studies into this topic and you want to see how it plays out in the real world. So with theory testing mode, you might have association claims, causal claims. Your goal is to test a theory. You want to isolate variables. You really want to get down to the nitty-gritty of that theory. Here you're prioritizing internal validity, making sure that you have the best designed study that you possibly can. You're probably going to have to introduce artificial situations. You'll pull people into the lab, maybe you do a questionnaire, those kinds of things. External validity is not at all a priority here. The priority here is having a well-designed study, really drilling down to the basics of the theory you're investigating. And you know that the real world will come later. In generalization mode, maybe a theory is pretty well established through various lab studies, and you want to take it out in the world and say, okay, how does this play out in the real world? What's the frequency of this? Does it hold up? Does it have that ecological validity that we've been looking for? So you'll have frequency claims. Maybe you want to make a claim about a population, this percentage of people do this, have this kind of optimist orientation, whatever it happens to be that you're looking at. And in this case, external validity is absolutely essential. That's really the purpose of your entire study here. So again, depending on where you are in the research process, you have to prioritize different things. It's always a balancing act. So maybe you start with a well-designed study, you want to get those theories, get those constructs, and then later down the road you can turn to the bigger picture and start to generalize to the real world and to your population. Just a quick reminder about this excellent table, table 3.5 here, that lists our different kind of validity and then gives example questions to ask for each type of claim that we have: frequency, association, and causal. So as you are reading a study, as you're evaluating the importance of this study to your life, to society in general, remember to look at this table, ask these kinds of questions to really dig down and interrogate these research claims. Now, I mentioned in the last lecture that a lot of times we'll hear about new research studies from journalists. Sometimes they'll do their due diligence and they'll report a single study in in context with all of the research in that particular field. But I'm worried that oftentimes what we see is journalists picking some kind of sensational topic and just giving us results from one single study. So we have to ask some questions. We have to apply some critical thinking. This takes practice, but here are some questions to get you started. So again, we're considering the external validity in this lecture. So oftentimes we might be tempted to say, look at this single interesting result. So that's the entire purpose of journalism sometimes, right? They want to get the viewers, they want to get the readers, they want to get those website clicks. Instead of falling for those kinds of things, work on asking, was that result replicated? Is this a single study? Have other labs replicated it? Has this been done before? Are there any extensions? All of those questions that we've been talking about. If you notice that it's a single study, say that is a single study. How does it fit within the entire literature? So maybe this particular study happens to go against the grain of 20 years of research. If that's the case, that's going to change your confidence in those results. And that's information that you need to know to make a good decision. You might ask, how well do the methods of this study get at the theory they were asking? So again, what questions did they ask? How was their sample derived? How did they do all of these different things? Instead of saying something like, I don't think this study is important because the methods had nothing to do with the real world. So remember, they might not be interested in the ecological validity at this stage. Maybe they're in the theory building stage, which is a completely different priority. Was the study conducted in generalization mode? If so, were the participants sampled randomly? So again, are they interested in generalization? Are they interested in theory building? So when you start to ask all of these different questions, you can kind of pull apart those research studies and really interrogate the validity of the study. So there are a couple more here, but I don't think that I really need to read them to you. These are just some tools for you to keep, to remember as we go through not only this class, but I think they'll be very helpful in your everyday life as well. As these journalists, they're going to keep finding these research studies, they're going to keep reporting them, and these questions will really give you a nice toolkit to ask, should I be swayed by this? What kinds of things should I be asking? What kinds of things should I be searching for in this journalist report to be more confident to decide if this should impact my life or not?